That assembly had been loaded with an enormous burthen. The king had been precipitated from his throne, and the monarchy existed no longer. The republic had been established without consulting the people, and the king had been put to death because his existence was troublesome to the assembly. The members soon became few, and they were composed of elements too hostile to one another to be able to direct affairs securely and rapidly. They enacted, therefore, among themselves a government called the Committee of Public Safety that was to superintend the general administration of the country and to direct the exertions of France against her foreign enemies. They instituted also a Committee of General Safety that was to suppress the attacks of interior foes. The successes of the Vendéans and of the Allied armies carried these two committees beyond all reasonable ideas and made the convention feel that it must conquer or die. Defense was maintained with all the force and energy that personal safety and revenge can inspire. The excellent direction given to the armies, which they followed with admirable courage, preserved France from a foreign yoke, but the progress of civil war and the secret exertions of the royalists could scarcely justify the massacres and the horrible tyranny under which the country groaned for so long a period. The rulers of the assembly will remain forever loaded with the odium which their barbarous government, of which history does not present another instance, will excite among future generations. Of all the lessons given by the history of human passions, there is one especially in which the moralist must insist with force. I mean the impossibility which the most honorable men will ever experience of stopping, if once their passions draw them into the path of error. Surely, if a few years before so many crimes were committed, they could have been pictured before the eyes of the most barbarous among their perpetrators. I fear not to say that all, even Robespierre himself, would have recoiled with horror. Men begin by caressing theories. Heated imagination presents them as useful and easy of execution. They toil. They advance unconsciously from errors to faults, and from faults to crimes, till the contaminated mind corrupts sensibility and adorns by the same name of state policy the most horrible outrages. It must, however, be acknowledged that several of those men felt justified and perhaps encouraged by the praises which historians of all ages have lavished on the scourges of humanity. The pulpit itself has not been able to avoid so fatal a folly. Every schoolboy has learned by heart the beautiful picture of Cromwell drawn by Bossuet. A man was found, etc. What ambitious mind can hesitate on the road to crime when he reads such praises written by the first of sacred orators? The Cardinal de Richelieu found a defender in the grave and wise author of L'Esprit des Lois, the spirit of the law. His cruelty, his thirst of blood and revenge are considered by most historians as the workings of a superior mind, or at least as a proud contempt for humanity. The memory of that man has perhaps done more harm to France than his genius did her good. That execrable maxim, the dead never rise again, is written in letters of blood throughout his history, and I have many reasons to believe that the rulers of the convention had chosen him for their model. The horrible system of killing one's enemies instead of subduing them, and of reigning by the aid of terror, is convenient to cowardly and narrow minds. But men of elevated genius follow other maxims. They know that scaffolds are but indifferent means of government. Henry IV was the most indulgent of sovereigns, and he made himself popular by gaining the affections of everyone. Once he gave way to a fatal and sanguinary policy. It is but too sure that the death of Biron was of no use, either to his own authority or to the happiness of the following generations. The rage of the convention necessarily drew to an end. The government they had established exercised their tyranny on themselves. Fear gave birth to despair. Thousands of victims had been butchered under the eyes of the assembly, which remained insensible and at last sacrificed the government to its own safety. But it did not foresee that general contempt would succeed to terror. In vain did the convention expel and punish such of its members as had bathed themselves in blood. In vain did it recall those who had made themselves respected by their courage and humanity. Hatred and indignation assailed it on all sides, and such was its situation that even when adopting an amended course, it was surrounded by the distrust of all honorable men and the clamor and threats of a populace whose perverseness it had itself completed by encouraging outrage. In the month of Prairial, the Faubourg Saint-Antoine besieged the assembly and came to seek for victims in its bosom. And if the convention was not forced to submit, it was owing to the heroic resistance of Voici d'Anglas, whose admirable courage subdued the mob. The assembly resolved at last on a desperate measure, the only one that could succeed. Regular troops were called in, and Pichegru led them to the suburb. The rebels were disarmed and humbled. This victory, which did not cost a drop of blood, has delivered us for a long while, I hope, from the fury of the rabble. When I arrived in Paris, these events had already taken place. The convention was at that time completing a constitution, which was not good, which at least gave force and independence to the executive power, while it preserved the representative system. But the nation would accept nothing from that polluted assembly, and, notwithstanding all its exertions, the Constitution was but little approved of. The convention, not wishing to renew the fault committed by the Constituent Assembly, who had abandoned the fruit of their labors to jealous and hostile hands, had passed a law declaring that 2/3 of its members were necessarily to belong to the new councils established by the Constitution. Public opinion, however, was against them all, so that when the citizens came together in the primary assemblies to vote on the Constitution and on the law of the 2/3, they were exasperated publicly by orators whose misfortune and resentment had soured, and secretly by crafty royalists. Must we, they said, continue to see for several years, sitting among our legislature and deciding over our fate, men who have favored and practiced the most horrible tyranny? We will have nothing more to do with them. Let them go. It is sufficient that we accept their labor and ensure their safety by a generous oblivion of their crimes. Such violent speeches, repeated with emphasis in all the assemblies, stirred up the spirit of the citizens, who, after having in vain attempted to reject the constitutional act and the law of the 2/3, resolved to repel by force of arms those whom they had not been able to remove by their votes. General Menou was commander-in-chief of the military division. General Delisle made me acquainted with all the details of his staff. The regular troops at the disposal of government did not amount to above 5,000 men. They were sufficient to maintain tranquility, but not to oppose 30,000 hostile and well-armed National Guards. It was not possible to draw any troops from the armies. The war was going on actively. The disturbances in the Vendée were not suppressed, and strong forces were required against the robberies of the Chouans. It was therefore resolved to deceive the people in regard to the weakness of the garrison by multiplying its movements so that it continually marched out of one gate and into another. This little stratagem was soon discovered. It augmented the assurance of the leaders of the sections, and the day for the attack was fixed. On the evening of the 12th of Vendémiaire, 2nd October, several battalions of National Guards had taken up arms. Those of the Petit Père and the Filles Saint-Thomas assembled in the Rue Vivienne. General Menou surrounded them with regular troops and summoned them to disperse. He might have forced them to do so without engaging in a battle, but an orator stepped out of the ranks and began to harangue the general with a warmth which he communicated to his comrades. Menou had the weakness to listen to him and even to answer him. From that account, all was lost. The battalion remained, and the general retired, giving them a proof of his irresolution and leaving government in doubt concerning his fidelity. The convention felt that such a man might ruin its cause. The command was taken from him during the night and given to the deputy Barras. A commission of public safety was also appointed, to whom very extensive powers were given. Barras was a man of resolution and had greatly contributed to the fall of Robespierre on the 9th of Thermidor. Having been a commissioner of the convention with the Southern Army in 1793, he had remarked a young officer of artillery whose courage and advice had a great influence on the retaking of Toulon. This young man, who after the 9th of Thermidor had been dismissed by one of his former comrades called Aubry, a member of the convention, had come to Paris a few months before, where he was soliciting, without success, his restoration to his rank of general brigade. Vexation and disgust had, it was said, made him at last seek permission to go at the head of a troop of cannoneers to serve among the Turks, to teach them the maneuvers of artillery. He was ready to set off when Barras sent for him and presented him to the committee, who consulted him on the difficulty, which they were resolved to get out of at any price. The members of the committee agreed with one another on one point only, that is to say, that all was lost if the sections gained the victory. Civil war would then extend its ravages all over France, and nobody could calculate its consequences. On the other hand, they could not bring themselves to fire upon the people. Some wanted to make concessions which would have destroyed all hope of redress. Others spoke stoically, waiting death in their chairs like true Romans. The artillery officer laughed both at their scruples and ridiculous resolution. He demonstrated to them that the Parisians were nothing but fools, led on by cunning rogues, that government had in its favor power and right, that nothing was easier than to disperse, without spilling much blood, inexperienced battalions which had neither clever leaders nor artillery. His firmness, his eloquence, his consciousness of great superiority, which his countenance itself betrayed, inspired confidence and carried persuasion into the minds of everyone. This young man's name was Bonaparte. The command of the artillery was given to him, and he was left master of all the arrangements for the defense. He immediately assembled the officers and made himself sure of their obedience. He then placed 2 cannons at the entrance of the Rue Saint-Nicaise, another facing the church of Saint-Roch at the bottom of the Petite Rue du Dauphin, 2 more in the Rue Saint-Honoré near the Place Vendôme, and 2 facing the Point Royal on the Quai Voltaire. Reserves of infantry were stationed behind the cannon in order to protect them, and on the Place du Carrousel, the cavalry was posted in the Place Louis XV. He afterwards acquainted the battalions that they were at liberty to remain where they were as long as they chose, but that if they went one step beyond the prescribed limits, or if they fired a single musket, he would repel them with his artillery. His firmness, instead of inspiring awe, convinced the enemy that he was afraid and would not dare to fire. After a good deal of hesitation, the enemy's troops put themselves in motion, those who were behind pushing on those who were in front, and a discharge of musketry was the signal of the attack. At the same instant, the grape shot of the 3 field pieces carried death and terror into their ranks. Their flight was so rapid, so abrupt, and so complete that a bullet shot off along the Rue Saint-Honoré did not touch a single person. General Carteau had been placed on the Pont Neuf with a battalion of infantry of the line in order to cut off the communication between the 2 banks of the Seine. I was sent to carry him in order to stand firm, but he had already retired under the garden of the Infant, and the columns of the sections appeared already on the Quai de la Monnaie, with a view to make themselves masters of the Point Royal, and attack the Tuileries from that side. The general who commanded at the foot of the bridge sent them word not to advance any farther. They took no heed of it, and received a discharge of the 2 cannons, after which they dispersed. That was enough to make the citizens tired of fighting, but the most determined among them, whose fear had subsided when they imagined the danger distant, wanted to resume the attack. They had made themselves masters of the Palais Royal, and like madmen, fancied they should be able to defend themselves there. Luckily, night brings counsel. In the morning, the leaders put themselves in safety, and the rest went home. Peace was signed next day, and order was reestablished. I do not think that the regular troops lost more than 4 or 5 men. On the part of the sections, the loss was more considerable. By the most exact calculation, it seems to have amounted to 40 killed and about 200 wounded. This will not appear exaggerated if we consider that the steps of the church of Saint-Roch were covered with people, that the cannon fired in that direction was at no more than 60 paces distant, and that the battalion of the Rue Saint-Honoré filled the whole space to a great depth. The command of the Parisian army was entrusted to General Denican, a man almost unknown, even in the ranks, where he had served for some time, and whom the Restoration did not bring into distinction. Government felt that a too severe inquiry on this affair would only contribute to exasperate the minds of the public, and that they ought to enjoy with moderation a victory which had been bought at the price of so much blood. A court-martial was nevertheless instituted with a view to frighten the leaders, but they were all acquitted, with the exception of one unfortunate emigrant named Lafont, who had got secretly into Paris in order to intrigue in favor of his employers, and who had made himself conspicuous by a very violent behavior. He was sentenced to death, but even he would have to be saved if his intense devotion to the cause of the Bourbons had not made him reject all the means he might have used to avoid his condemnation. The Royalists have pretended of late years that this insurrection of the Parisians was a generous effort attempted in favor of the Bourbons. I declare that this is not the fact. I was placed in the most favorable position for observing the passions and intrigues which brought about the unfortunate catastrophe of the 13th of Vendémiaire. I was acquainted with several honorable men who had taken part with the sections, and I saw neither in the people nor in their leaders any wish for the return of the Bourbons, much less a plan for recalling them. The death of the king was deplored by all sensible men, but liberty was beloved. Hatred of the convention was carried to the highest pitch on account of the horrors with which that assembly had visited the country. I questioned the most violent as to what they wished to establish in the place of expiring government. Their answer was, "We will have nothing more to do with them. It is the republic we wish for. We want honest men to govern us." No one went farther than this. It is true that some insinuations were made in the sections in favor of the royal family, but so feeble, so ambiguous, that very little attention was paid to them. No one thought of pronouncing the name of that family. I have no doubt that, if the sections had triumphed, the attempt would have been more direct and more bold. Perhaps it would have succeeded, but then civil war would have broken out on all sides. And if 18 years later, with the aid of all Europe, the Bourbons were unable to maintain themselves on the throne, what would have been their fate at a period when France, not yet accustomed to the yoke, was animated by republican habits and ideas and uncurbed energy? 2 days after the 13th of Vendémiaire, Barras introduced to the convention all the generals and officers of the staff who had contributed to save that assembly. General Bonaparte was there, but he mingled with the crowd. When Barras, in his speech, pronounced his name with compliment, those who surrounded him wanted to make him advance to the first rank. He pushed them aside with a look of ill humor and diffidence, which pleased me. There was in his actions less of pride than a delicate feeling of propriety. He was ashamed to be praised for such a victory. Besides, it is certain he felt no great esteem for those in whose favor he had fought, and who were thus lavishing their applause on him. The convention hastened to put an end to its stormy session so fatal to humanity, but still so memorable from the incredible vigor with which it saved France from a foreign yoke. The reins of government were delivered into the hands of the Directory. General Bonaparte was made commander-in-chief of the 1st Military Division and of the city of Paris. One of the first measures that were taken by the new government was a disarming of all the citizens of the metropolis. They delivered up their arms without much regret. The trial they had just made of their strength was not of a nature to inspire them with great confidence in themselves. This measure was executed with great vigor. Swords and sabers were comprehended in the general confiscation. The widow of General Beauharnais was going to deliver up to one of the commissioners entrusted with these orders the saber of her late husband, when her son Eugène, then scarcely 13 years old, seized the weapon and declared that they who wished to have it must first take his life. The commissioner consented to leave it to him, provided he got permission from the general-in-chief. Eugène flew to his house. The deep emotion the child evinced, his name, his interesting appearance, the ardor and simplicity with which he expressed his wishes touched the general. He embraced him, allowing him to keep the dearly beloved sword, and visited Madame de Beauharnais. She was young, amiable, and more than pretty. He fell in love with her, and soon after married her, so that their union, which so long a happy one, had its origin in an amiable trait of filial piety.